In January 1991, Eastern Airlines ceased all operations. 20,000 people woke up without jobs. One of America's largest airlines simply ceased to exist. The official justification? Deregulation destroyed the industry. Oil crises crushed costs, and inflexible unions broke the company. But what if I told you that Eastern Airlines didn't go bankrupt because it failed, but because someone decided it was worth more dismantled than operating? Founded in 1926, Eastern became one of the Big Four, the four giants that dominated American aviation, alongside American, United, and TWA. Eastern controlled the East Coast like no other. Miami, New York, Atlanta, Washington, Boston. If you flew between these cities in the 70s and 80s, you probably flew Eastern. And it wasn't just presence, it was total market dominance. The most emblematic example? The Eastern Airlines shuttle. This air bridge service between New York, Washington, and Boston was revolutionary. No reservation needed. You simply showed up and flew. If one plane filled up, they'd put out another. Demand was so high, the operation literally printed money. The numbers were impressive. In '78, Eastern transported more than 38 million passengers. It had a fleet of nearly 300 aircraft. Lockheed L-1011s, Boeing 727s, Douglas DC-9s. It employed more than 37,000 people. More importantly, it was profitable. Throughout the 70s, Eastern reported consistent operating profits. It had positive cash flow. It paid dividends. It invested in fleet renewal. By any conventional financial metric, it was a healthy company. The slogan, "The Wings of Man," wasn't empty marketing. It reflected a clear identity and a promise the company delivered. With all this established, the question is, so what happened? 1978. President Jimmy Carter signs the Airline Deregulation Act. Since 1938, the government had rigidly controlled aviation through the Civil Aeronautics Board. They decided who could fly, where, how much to charge. It was a completely regulated system, almost a shared legal monopoly. Suddenly, the floodgates opened. Any company with capital could enter. Exclusive routes became battlegrounds. New companies emerged literally overnight. Southwest Airlines expanded nationally. People Express appeared offering tickets at impossible prices. New York Air, Midway, America West, dozens of competitors. And they had an advantage: lean structures, no decades of complex union contracts, no legacy systems, no old operational commitments. They operated with costs 40 to 50% lower than the established giants. A route that cost $200 on Eastern dropped to $89 on Southwest. And it worked. Passengers didn't care about onboard meals if they paid half the price. But what seemed like price and route adjustments would end up becoming something more dangerous. The second blow came. 1979. The oil crisis had arrived. Between '79 and '81, aviation kerosene prices quadrupled. Companies operating with 3 to 5% margins saw numbers turn red instantly. The result? Total disaster. The entire industry collapsed. But here's the crucial point. The market became difficult, not impossible. Southwest grew. Delta adapted successfully. American restructured and emerged strong. United survived. The environment was hostile, but not a death sentence. Well-managed companies that made smart strategic choices weathered the storm. So why did Eastern, with such valuable assets, such strategic routes, begin to crumble so catastrophically? The answer isn't in external forces, it's in the deliberate decisions made within Eastern's own executive offices, and those decisions began in 1986 with Frank Lorenzo. 1986. In February '86, Frank Lorenzo, through Texas Air Corporation, takes control of Eastern Airlines. If that name means nothing, pay attention. Frank Lorenzo wasn't just any other executive, he had a reputation, and it wasn't good. In 1981, Lorenzo bought Continental Airlines. What he did next shocked the industry. In 1983, he deliberately put Continental into bankruptcy, Chapter 11, not because it was broke, but as a strategic maneuver to break union contracts and redesign the cost structure. It worked. He came out with a restructured Continental, drastically lower costs, and weakened unions. Now he controlled Eastern, and immediately something changed. The operational philosophy flipped upside down. Before Lorenzo, Eastern, even with market challenges, operated with a long-term vision. It invested in training, maintained rigorous maintenance standards, cultivated corporate relationships, thought about building a sustainable brand. After Lorenzo, only one metric mattered: cost-cutting, not strategic cuts, aggressive, deep, indiscriminate cuts. But what didn't make sense, Eastern still had incredibly valuable assets. The shuttle, still profitable. Miami Latin America routes, near monopolistic dominance. Slots at LaGuardia National Airport, worth tens of millions. The fleet, relatively modern.
When Lorenzo took over in 1986, Eastern already had debt. Normal. Airlines operate with leverage because planes are expensive. But what happened next wasn't normal. It was systemic. The debt exploded. Between 86 and 89, Eastern accumulated hundreds of millions in new loans. And these weren't conventional long-term loans with reasonable interest. They were high-risk loans, exorbitant interest, short terms. The obvious question, why? For what? To operate, to pay current expenses. Eastern entered a vicious cycle. Borrowed money to cover day-to-day costs, then borrowed more to pay interest on previous loans, then more to cover cash flow holes. And here's the critical point. It wasn't incompetence, it wasn't mistakes, it was intentional design. Why? Because the more indebted it became, the more dependent it became on generating immediate liquidity, quick cash, to avoid default. And how do you generate cash when operations are bleeding? You sell assets. And the more assets you sell, the less sustainable operations become. It's a death loop, a self-reinforcing cycle of degradation. But wait, if the company had difficulties, why not healthy restructuring? Why not seek long-term investors? Why not negotiate with creditors to extend terms? Why accelerate debt and force the company into a dead end? A disturbing possibility emerges. Maybe the goal was never to save Eastern as an operating company. Maybe it was to prepare it to be dismantled and liquidated. And the next move confirms this hypothesis. In October 1986, Eastern sold the shuttle, the air bridge, the money printing machine, the most profitable part of the entire company, sold. To whom? Donald Trump for $365 million. The official justification: generate capital and pay debts. But think, if the ship is sinking, do you sell the only working lifeboat? It didn't make sense. Unless the goal isn't to save the ship, but to profit from the shipwreck. And the shuttle wasn't an isolated case, it was the beginning of a pattern. Highly profitable international routes between Miami and Latin America, dominated by Eastern for decades, were sold or terminated. Newer, more efficient aircraft, returned or sold. Valuable slots at LaGuardia, National, and Logan, traded. Parts, ground equipment, maintenance contracts, everything liquidated. Eastern wasn't getting rid of what was losing money, it was selling exactly what worked. And the most serious detail, who was buying many of these assets? Other companies linked to Frank Lorenzo's group. Continental, also owned by Texas Air, directly benefited. Routes, planes, and slots changed hands. It wasn't mismanagement, it was methodical value transfer. The most profitable assets were extracted, while the remaining shell, increasingly weaker, continued operating under the Eastern name. In 1988, Eastern still transported millions, still had demand and a strong brand, but it was being hollowed out from within. And while this was happening financially, another war was being fought, even more destructive. 1987. Lorenzo presents the unions with immediate salary cuts of 20 to 40%. No transition, no timeline. In practice, experienced pilots would drop from 80,000 to less than 50,000. flight attendants from 25,000 to 21,000, mechanics and ground crews the same. The unions saw the numbers, and they didn't add up. Eastern still generated billions. It had valuable assets. The problem wasn't lack of revenue. High interest, expensive consultancies, executive bonuses, and constant value transfer to other Texas Air companies. The unions, led by mechanists Charlie Bryan, said no, and the war began. Lorenzo escalated, hired non-union workers, threatened bankruptcy, and created a hostile environment. The response came. Pilots refused overtime, mechanics followed regulations to the letter, flight attendants cut additional services. Trust died. Delays exploded, cancellations became routine, maintenance dragged on. Operations entered chaos. And the most disturbing part, this wasn't an accident, it was strategy. Each delay, each cancellation served as an argument for drastic measures, which always meant the same thing: more cuts, more sales, more value transfer. And soon, those who began to feel all this were the passengers.
1989. Passengers began to notice something was wrong. Planes visibly dirtier, broken seats not fixed, bathrooms in terrible condition, flight attendants clearly unmotivated and stressed, chronic delays, not the occasional flight, almost every flight. The experience of flying Eastern, once synonymous with reliability on the East Coast, became synonymous with frustration. In 1989, the FAA imposed more than $9 million in fines against Eastern for maintenance violations. For a company already financially suffocated, operating at the limit of liquidity, these fines were devastating. Each cycle worsened the previous one. In December 1988, Eastern had operating losses of more than $100 million for the year. In 1989, it was losing more than $10 million per month. And then came the final blow. March '89, the unions go on strike. The Machinists and Aerospace Workers Union, led by Charlie Bryan, said enough. Immediately, Lorenzo appeared on national TV, blaming the unions. On March 9th, Eastern files for Chapter 11, protection from creditors while attempting reorganization. And that's the narrative that stuck. The unions destroyed Eastern with a strike at the worst moment. But here's the truth the numbers show. The strike didn't kill Eastern, it just exposed that it was already dead. Within days, Eastern collapsed. No cash reserves, no credit, no uncommitted liquid assets. The strike just pulled the plug. During Chapter 11, there were public promises of recovery, restructuring plans presented, speeches about coming back stronger. But behind the scenes, in court documents, a different reality was clear. Asset sales continued, accelerated. Planes sold or returned, routes transferred or terminated, even gates and slots were auctioned off. The debt was mathematically impossible to restructure. The numbers didn't add up. Even operating, Eastern lost millions every week. Month after month, losses accumulated. 1991. In January, 2 years after Chapter 11, trustee Martin Shugru made the final decision and decided there was nothing more to be done. January 18, 1991. Eastern ceases all operations. 62 years of history, over. 20,000 jobs, gone. Pilots with 30-year careers woke up unemployed. Mechanics who dedicated their entire lives were left with nothing. Flight attendants, ground crews, administrative staff, 20,000 families. And the executives? Frank Lorenzo left with millions in compensation and bonuses. Senior executive team? Equally well compensated. The workers? Lost unpaid wages, pensions, benefits. Creditors fought for years over the remains, but almost nothing was left. The valuable assets had already been sold. We return to the central question that began this investigation. Did Eastern fail because the market changed, or because someone decided it was worth more dismantled? These aren't errors, they're not coincidences, they're deliberate patterns. Some companies go bankrupt because they fail. Others go bankrupt because someone decides they're worth more dismantled than operating. Eastern Airlines was the latter.